Hello, dear listeners. I would like to introduce myself. My name is Xenofon Kotseris, and right here beside me is Marieta Filipa. We are both English tutors and great fans of the works of William Shakespeare.
Hello, fellow listeners. It's a great pleasure to participate in this session concerning William Shakespeare, one of the greatest playwrights of all times.
First of all, I would like to clarify that this is a work done with the use of internet sources, and specifically, we would like to express our gratitude towards the Folger Library and, of course, Wikipedia. We do not claim to be scholars or any kind of experts on the subject, so please be lenient on us.
Our aim is to familiarize our listeners with the plays and sonnets written by Shakespeare. Today's goal is to look into the era that he and his contemporaries lived in, his life and his works in general.
Firstly, Shakespeare lived in a fervent period of European cultural, artistic, political, and economic rebirth following the Middle Ages. Generally described as taking place from the 14th century to the 17th century, the Renaissance promoted the rediscovery of classical philosophy, literature, and art.
He was born in 1564 and died in 1616 at the age of 52. During most of his lifetime, Queen of England was Elizabeth I. She reigned from 1558 until 1603. She led a nation in relative peace, economic expansion, and the highest point of English cultural nationalism in the whole period of the Renaissance. Elizabeth's reign was highlighted by her stunning and complete defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588, led by the Royal Navy her father had built, with a bit of help from bad weather and the treacherous and rocky Irish coastline. Her predecessor on the throne was Bloody Mary, who was enthroned in 1553 and whose goal was to return Roman Catholicism to England. She died of tuberculosis in 1558, so it was Elizabeth's turn to rule, and she did so intelligently and decisively. Elizabeth remained unmarried throughout her life, and she was known as the Virgin Queen. By 1600, Shakespeare had given 6 command performances in the court of Queen Elizabeth. Elizabeth's successor was James I. When he came to power, he would increase favor and sponsorship of Shakespeare and the arts. James was a prolific supporter of the theatre in these days, and as a result, Shakespeare's wealth grew, enabling him to make shrewd business deals and acquire property in Stratford and London.
I have to say that the official religion of the nation was Protestantism. Shakespeare was baptized as a Protestant, but there are claims that his family had connections with the Roman Catholic Church, which was at the time illegal in England, and those who belonged to this religion were tortured and driven out of society. It is obvious throughout his works that he derided Protestantism and everything associated with it. Nevertheless, Shakespeare had noble patrons from the court of his queen and later on his king. But, to be honest, he had devout enemies that sought theatre to be abolished, such as Calvinists, an upcoming class of Protestant merchants with power and wealth that believed that the theatre was a hotbed of sins. This was quite a paradox.
I would like to talk a little about theatre at that time. In Shakespeare's time, a stage wasn't just one type of space. Plays had to be versatile. The same play might be produced in an outdoor playhouse, an indoor theatre, a royal palace, or for a company on tour, the courtyard of an inn. In any of these settings, men and boys played all the characters, male and female, including in Renaissance England, Acting, in Renaissance England was an exclusively male profession. Audiences had their favorite performers, looked forward to hearing music with the productions, and relished the luxurious costumes of the leading characters. The stage itself was relatively bare. For the most part, playwrights used vivid words instead of scenery to picture the scene on stage.
Now let's talk about Shakespeare himself. Shakespeare was born in Stratford-upon-Avon, England in 1564. The exact date of his birth isn't known, but it is generally celebrated on April 23rd. We do know that he was baptized on April 26th, and it was common practice at the time to have an infant be baptized no later than the first Sunday after birth. He died on the 23rd of April in 1616.
But what about his education?
Well, we can only speculate about his education. We know that the King's New School in Stratford-upon-Avon was considered excellent. The school was one of the English grammar schools established to educate young men, primarily in Latin grammar and literature. As in other schools of the time, students began their studies at the age of 4 or 5 in the attached petty school, and there learned to read and write in English, studying primarily the Catechism from the Book of Common Prayer. After 2 years in the petty school, students entered the lower form of the grammar school, where they began the serious study of Latin grammar and Latin texts that would occupy most of the remainder of the school days. Several Latin texts that Shakespeare used repeatedly in writing his plays and poems were texts that schoolboys memorized and recited. Latin comedies were introduced early in the lower form. In the upper form, which the boys entered at age 10 or 11, students wrote their own Latin orations and declamations, studied Latin historians and rhetoricians, and began the study of Greek using the Greek New Testament.
Could you give us some information about his family?
His parents were John and Mary. His father was a glove maker and a successful entrepreneur. In 1582, at the age of 18, he married Anne Hathaway and they had 3 children. Their eldest daughter was called Susanna, and the other 2 were twins, Judith and Amnet. Amnet died at 11 and a half and was their only son.
What would you like to mention about his activities?
For several years after Judith and Hamlet's arrival in 1585, nothing is known for certain of Shakespeare's activities, how he earned a living, when he moved from Stratford, or how he got his start in the theatre. Following this gap in the record, the first definite mention of Shakespeare is in 1592 as an established London actor and playwright, mocked by a contemporary as a Shakespearean. The same writer alludes to one of Shakespeare's earliest history plays, Henry VI, Part 3, which must already have been performed. The next year, in 1593, Shakespeare published a long poem, Venus and Adonis. The first quarto editions of his early plays appeared in 1594. For more than 2 decades, Shakespeare had multiple roles in the London theatre as an actor, playwright, and in time a business partner in a major acting company, the Lord Chamberlain's Men, renamed the King's Men in 1603, under the patronage of the royal court. Over the years, he became steadily more famous in the London theatre world. His name, which was not even listed on the first quarters of his plays, became a regular feature, clearly a selling point, on later title pages. His plays were performed mainly in the Globe Theatre in London, but in courts and other theatres as well. His star actor was Richard Burbage.
Could you inform us about his works?
Shakespeare's playwriting is traditionally divided into three periods. The early period, also the most prosperous period of his life, from 1592 to 1601, the tragic period from 1600 to 1610, and the later period from 1610 to 1616. These three divisions of his work reveal much about the development of his vision as a writer. Some have suggested that these periods reflect the evolution of the man along with his art, while others caution that reading too much into these divisions may give readers a false impression of the diversity and liveliness of Shakespeare himself. Scholars also caution that to ignore his poetry throughout this period is to miss an enormous contribution of Shakespeare. He wrote at least 154 sonnets. In the early period, he wrote 20 plays. Some of them are Romeo and Juliet, A Midsummer Night's Dream, and The Merchant of Venice. During the tragic period, from 1600 until 1607, he wrote 7 plays. These are the most influential and long-studied plays in history, such as King Lear and Othello. 8 plays were written in the late period from 1610 till his death, including The Tempest and Henry VIII.
I would like to inform our listeners about the publications at that time. 18 of Shakespeare's works were published in quartos, and in 1623, almost 8 years after his death, his friends gathered and published the first folio edition, which incorporated all his works.
Well, that's a good introduction about Shakespeare and his contribution to the English culture.
Thank you for your compliment.
So, dear listeners, we will continue our lectures with a study on Romeo and Juliet. Goodbye for now.
Goodbye.